Yes, sir. And we are live with JT follows JC. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome. I have been diving into your work since our mutual friend Paul Stobbs I've watched a bunch of podcasts where you and he and your boy Alpha Talks were all kind of jumping into the little season. And it was the first time I'd actually started to even think about the little season since Conspiracy R Us had brought it up a few years ago. And just the way you presented your journey and like what had brought you to connecting, some of the Antiquitech and what people had been calling Tartarian structures to the little season just for me has been enthralling. And I had to have you on a stream so we could just like bro out and kind of dive into that issue. Because for me, it's just cleaning up so many loose ends that I had with the Christianity that I was exposed to. So thank you so much for coming on.
Sure thing, man. Yeah, I guess obviously we all feel the same way because I think I'm really new to this because I was maybe started considering it a little bit like the end of last year. It was kind of like it was a conversation for over the past year, but it wasn't really until I had Alpha Talks on my show, and it was like he had I was at a few things where I was kind of like I needed answers to certain questions. He had great answers, so I was like. Yeah, and then once you start to like be willing to accept it, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. And you I was endeared to you in the sense that you were telling those guys that your dad used to do, he was essentially a plaster mason and he would do all these types of construction that I do right now. I deal in a way, I do like lath, but I do lath with metal and
Mm-hmm.
because I do a lot of ferro cement construction. So you were making all these arguments that I was laughing so hard that I agreed with you because like people are like, oh, they just made out that stucco and lath. And yeah, who cares that it's like 4 feet thick wall? Yeah, they just threw that together, and I'm just sitting over here and being like, guys, you have no idea how much work goes into lath. Like you have no idea what plaster and moving, mortar and cement and all this stuff and like the timelines that are given, all of it. So I just want to back up a little bit. I know you have a bigger audience than I do, but I want to introduce you to my audience for you to give them a little bit of a background of who you are, where you come from, like what your day job is, and kind of what brought you into this field of study.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So a little about myself. I'm a guy who was raised in a Christian family, kind of just like very traditional suburbia. Yeah, my father owned a construction company. Now my brother and I took over the business. After he retired. Yeah, it's plastering, drywall, metal framing. So yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, talking to my dad about that when they would make the arguments about like when I was first kind of like talking about the World Fair stuff, and I was like, Dad, that's not a good answer when they say, "Oh, it was only plaster." It was only plaster and metal lath and all that. And I said, Dad, you look at how ornate that is, and he was like, and it was funny because like he was stumped. He was like, he wasn't willing to say, "Oh, well that no need to research any further now. That's a good answer." He was like, "No, that doesn't make any sense." But yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home, and kind of I'm in my mid 40s now. I've kind of not been a conspiracy theorist until probably very recently. Probably started to ask questions, last 5-10 years, but then like obviously after 2020 really started to ask questions like, well, none of
Hmm.
this seems true. And then I really I had a tough year, besides the normal stuff. Went through a divorce. um I had to move back in with my parents. My dad got cancer during all
Mm.
this kind of same time, and the God got me through it. I basically had to lean on God big time during that time. And during that time I was like, God really changed me in all kinds of ways. And I felt like I felt like we were living in the end times because like a lot of people say like, this is like, what else could it be? It's like, you know, we got a plague, we got like lockdowns, we got like things that I thought were stable in my life. I realized how unstable they were. And I realized it now, like that this world seems like it could shift big time. Like, so, I mean, I would think that like, I wouldn't have been surprised if it happened at that point. And then through that, God was changing me. I was reading my Bible again, real fresh eyes, trying to forget all the things I've been taught in churches and school. And it was working. And I was like, wow, I can't believe I never knew this was in here. We started going down the Genesis 6 rabbit hole, talking about the Nephilim, the fallen angels. Couldn't get enough learning about that. Then the, you know, kind of exposing wickedness in the culture. And then I started to make TikToks. It was like funny because like I never really thought about doing that. My brother said you should check out TikTok, and I thought this is like for 13-year-old girls. Like, why would a 40-year-old man like myself want to see this? And of course, he's sending me things about like going down the rabbit hole of like the Illuminati and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, this is actually they got this on TikTok. And so I started to. At one point, I made a video I had 3 followers. I made a video. It was like they put up this weird statue. I don't know if you remember, in front of the UN. And a lot of people likened it to like the Daniel statue. It was like a lion head. It's got like leopard spots. It's got wings. It's bear paws. Maybe it was like I said, it looked like a beast from the Bible. And so I made a video about that because I knew I had to show people it, and got like 10,000 views. Before you know it, I had 1,000 followers. Then I did a series of end times videos, and I had 20,000 followers. And then before you know, like within 6 months, I had 100,000. And then I started to then people say, hey, you should do a podcast. And I started to transition to other platforms, got banned on TikTok, made a movie about Nephilim with my buddy called Ancient Angels. And then before you know it, I was like, people were asking me about the Tataria stuff. And I was like, it's really weird. I don't really know what to do with that. So I kind of put it to the side. And it wasn't until people started to kind of like put the two together about, hey, wait a minute, Jesus is saying he's coming back in the 1st century pretty clearly. So what if this was evidence that he said what he meant? And, you know, long story short, that's kind of how it was. And I think at the same time, I was growing my platform on YouTube, and we just started talking about this. And it's just, I don't know, lots of conspiracies make sense in this conspiracy. Like this is like the mother of all conspiracies, and like everything's game in this. And it's like it gives you a reason why in almost every scenario.
It really does. It really does. That's what I like about it. I'd been on to Anatoly Flamenco's work for about 10 years. I had read 2 of Michael Heiser's books. I had listened to the Naked Bible podcast for, up until his death. And so I always had sort of a supernatural look at the Bible. And for me, the Bible in and of itself was more of like an alchemical text. I looked at things from a very astrotheological perspective. And I always really what vibed with me the most was like reading Jesus, reading about Jesus, reading Matthew. And that always resonated with me. I had a saved moment when I was in college where I had this incredible, direct connection with Jesus, gave my life to him. And then the church I was going to was just absolutely hypocritical. Like there was nothing redeeming that I could find about the church. They asked me to leave when I was asking them too many questions, yada, yada, yada. And so my journey with this is like with my conditioning and with what I've been exposed to, it's just like having the little season now gives me a pretext of why so much of the church experience that I've had in my short life, it has been somewhat like it seems grafted, like it seems telegraphed is a better way to say it. It doesn't seem like it's a lie, Like I used to listen to Derek Prince, like Paul Stobbs and I share that in common. Like I love Derek Prince, because Derek Prince is always calling out the church, like, where's the miracles? Like, where are the healings? Where are all these things that are promised to the believers? And I just think for myself, I've seen so many different things where, at least with just the churches I've been exposed to, their theology is based more around Zionism, and it's based more around this support, like being the support to this whole Middle Eastern story. And I kind of feel like this whole, little season action releases me from that miasm. You know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying?
Oh yeah,
Because that
definitely.
because that whole story, it seems so played out, especially this year with the red heifer thing. Like the fact
Mm-hmm.
that you guys are just trudging and just like hitting these beautiful conversations. And by the way, the conversations that the crew between you, Paul, Alpha Talks, and like your whole cohort of people, you guys, you could tell that like Christ is living in you because of the way you communicate. You guys are all respectful. You're not like, there's no, like, at least from an onlooker as a third party, like it's just like everything is a respectful dialogue, which there isn't like this pointing the finger or attacking or anything like that, which to me shows a lot of maturity and actually shows that energy of Christ is within. Like that shows me that it's actually there. So I really respect that. So I was just looking at the timing of things, and like here you have the red heifer on one side, and then you have UCATs coming along, and they're just blowing the lid off of everything to deal with the little season. Could you explain to the audience what the little season actually is for the people that don't know?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the timing was cool, and I yeah just spend a second talking about that. It was cool as like I said. So I came up making TikToks, and a lot of people have preconceived notions about what TikTok is, and I won't defend all the things about TikTok. But when I just started making videos, I really wasn't watching a lot, but I connected with a lot of like-minded Christians at the same time. And it's funny, like we were like-minded in a lot of ways. Some of them were more into flat Earth stuff before I was, and then some of them were, but a lot of them were like post-trib. People think it's the end times. And we all woke up like almost at the exact same time, and not because we convinced each other. So I think that's why
Mhm,
it does really feel like the Holy Spirit's moved here. And
mhm,
so I think, yeah, so it's kind of exciting to have conversations with them as we really are having like daily epiphanies. Oh, check this out. And so
mhm,
it's fun. But yeah, so if you guys are not aware, in Revelation chapter 20, it mentions, well, before Revelation 19 basically describes the battle of Armageddon. The beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Revelation 20 starts where the saints are resurrected. Jesus and the saints reign for 1,000 years. And before they do, Satan is bound. He's put into the bottomless pit, and he's not allowed to come out until the 1,000 years is over. And I think, like I said, it's funny, like going through the book of Revelation for years, and then kind of looking at, always like really being like, what is going on with, like, so God, so you're thinking like this has not happened yet. So you're thinking God decides to throw the beast in the lake of fire with the false prophet, but for some reason this Satan is still allowed to live, and then he's going to come out and deceive everybody again. And I thought, well, that's really strange. I don't understand that. And
mhm,
then you're thinking like, well, how could he just? So if kind of what you're taught about the millennial kingdom, where the modern church would teach that there's a rapture either before or after the tribulation, Jesus comes back, takes care of business, and then he sets up his kingdom right in the Jerusalem that we know, like the one that's on the news and everything. And so in that kind of scenario, it is kind of like, well, how's Satan going to trick everyone after that? Because I mean, it would be like, who's going to go? Hey, let's go fight Jesus, the God King. And it's
right.
like, nah, that doesn't seem. It seems like not likely. And maybe because we've been taught a little bit incorrectly about that, or that's been misinterpreted on how it was actually going to play out.
Mhm.
So yeah, so at this point, with that kind of understanding, like there is this time that's very deceptive. Like how could the devil deceive everyone? Well, he could possibly burn books. Well, the first thing he would have to do is he'd have to lie that Jesus ever came back. Probably makes
Right.
sense to me. He'd have to lie that anything previous ever happened. And so it might take some time. Maybe it takes a couple generations to burn books, bury buildings, destroy buildings, kind of basically wipe out any evidence that this stuff happened. And then so you have to ask yourself, if you were living in such a time, could you be deceived yourself?
Mhm.
And then, with humility, you would say, yeah, I mean, if all the nations were deceived, well, I mean, or not all, if the nations were deceived, well, then maybe so. And
Right.
now we started to revisit the scriptures, and like we could go through, many scriptures where Jesus is coming at a very specific time based on the Daniel prophecies. And a lot of that stuff gets like the abomination of desolation. So Daniel talks about it like a 70-week prophecy, 7 years, 70 weeks, 490 years. And so it just so happens from the decree to rebuild the temples when the prophecy starts, the 70th week starts off with Jesus being baptized. People debate whether that's exactly what happened, but midway through the 70th week, Jesus is crucified. And then you end it with the stoning of Stephen, that's 70 weeks. And so what the Daniel prophecy was all about was atonement. Israel was given this much more time. They were allowed to go back into the land. God gathered them back through Cyrus the Great. They rebuilt the temple, and there was a time of a chance to repent. Well, obviously, then with that context, you see how Jesus acts when he gets there. John the Baptist is literally calling the Pharisees a brood of vipers. Who warned you about the wrath to come? Jesus is saying that John the Baptist is Elijah, which the prophecy said that Elijah needed to come before the day of the Lord arrived. And with that kind of knowledge, you're like, oh my gosh, everything Jesus is saying, he's like, this wicked generation, all these things are going to come upon this generation. Matthew 24, he says, all these things will be fulfilled before this generation passes away. Was it Matthew 10:23? You won't have gone out through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Was it Matthew 16:28? Some of you standing here will not taste death until the Son of Man comes into his kingdom. He tells Caiaphas, the high priest, you're going to see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Father and coming in the clouds in great power. I think Zechariah 14:4, I believe, or 12:4. He says that those who see him who pierced him will see him and they'll mourn. Right. And you're like, so all these things where like a lot of these passages have been explained away. Oh, he wasn't really talking about that. And you're like, wait a minute. When you actually are willing to accept that, hey, maybe he wasn't, there is no other alternative interpretation in this. And I think the reason that many of us have not believed he was saying he was coming back then is because we've been told he hasn't come back yet.
Right. So, right. Yeah, it's just like growing up with a globe in every classroom that we were in, and you see NASA space shuttle. Like I grew up in Florida, so you see the space shuttle going up, and it's a point of pride. Like we don't see, a lot of us can't see past our pride. We think we know something, and then you just can't see past it. Like that's just that simple.
100%. Well, I think the biblical cosmology is a very good litmus test for this kind of thing, because it was funny. I did a podcast with my buddies, and it was two parts. The first thing was like, because these guys were big time in the flat earth, and we still I argued with one of them before on a live stream once because I just didn't want to talk about it. And we kind of talked about like the things that you were wrong about, you changed your mind about, and I really kind of like just like my personality, or the way I kind of presented myself was I'm a Bible believer. And then I started to get challenged on the parts of the Bible that were probably uncomfortable to believe and not be called crazy. And so like obviously biblical cosmology are one of those things. And so I would be like, no, it's a ball. Or I've seen videos that make it seem like I'm convinced it's the globe like we've always been taught. But then they would say, well, what about the firmament? What about this verse about this? What about all these verses say the earth's not movable? What about Joshua stopping the sun and the moon? And you're like, so you say you believe the Bible, but do you actually believe it? It's
Right.
a lot easier. It's a lot easier to accept the parts of the Bible that everyone accepts, and therefore you won't be called a kook, right?
Right.
And so there's so many things that I would say that we have been programmed to believe, and I think everybody who's obviously probably in these chats at this point would agree that it's like it really is like the Matrix. The way like that's presented is that before we even could think, we were told what all these things were. So that's why I said, so there's a lot of things, and so when you read the Bible, you take these preconceived notions into the reading of it, and so then you try to wrap the verses around the things that you already know. But then one day, praise God, he let me know that you've been lied to about almost everything. So then I started to say, no, I actually have to take the Bible and read that as this is the true thing, and then question everything that I've been told afterwards. Hey, wait a minute, if the Bible says this, how can this be so? And so, so then you have to reevaluate the idea that, hey, if everything you've been taught is a lie, what if they lied to you about the things that Jesus said? Because you know that those interpretations of like, oh, Jesus didn't mean that, he meant the transfiguration. Oh, he meant John would see him when he saw the vision to write Revelation. Like those things just kind of like, yeah, I guess I'll go with that. But it's like, it always kind of felt like unsatisfying. And then when people would challenge you about it, it would be like, yeah, like what the modern church ends up doing is calling Jesus a false prophet, because he clearly says he's coming back in that generation. And the way I know it for sure is that they ask him about the temple. He says it's going to be destroyed. They ask him when, and when will be the signs of these things, and when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. He tells them all the signs, and then he tells them when. Truly, right. I tell you, all these things will be fulfilled before this generation passes away. So he didn't leave any wiggle room for, well, he meant that, and then this other thing's going to happen later. It's like he didn't give us any wiggle room. And I think that God, Jesus being the Son of God and knowing what he's talking about, he didn't need to give any wiggle room. It was all going to happen then. And I think at this point, now we're really kind of peeling back the onion, like of the physical evidence of, hey, if he did come back, like he said he was, is there physical evidence of it? And now you start to revisit these old conspiracies about, hey, you know what's weird about the Dark Ages? They say, don't worry about the Dark Age. Nothing much happened that 1,000 years. And then you look at it, it's like, they sure built a lot of really impressive things in this time of basically ignorance and darkness. Maybe the Dark Ages weren't dark, they were light, and maybe the Enlightenment was not light, because that's when they decided we live on a spinning ball going around the sun. Eventually they say there's no God, evolution, all the things, and it's like, makes sense to me.
Yeah, this is amazing because I've done a couple podcasts with the Longo brothers. Do you know the Old World Florida channel at all?
I've watched a little bit of his stuff. He's pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, his assertion is that the area of North America, Mexico, and then like going down into the Yucatan Peninsula, that was essentially the Old Testament land.
Interesting.
And then because there's all these geographical things that only that landmass has that's spoken about in the Bible. And then at Noah, when the flood came, Noah ended up landing in what we now call the Middle East, like in I forget which mountain the ark was found in. It's really fun to listen to, but his brother, Professor Longo, is like an actual historian, and he's read pretty much every single book that there is on the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
In the Byzantium, and learning about what the Byzantine Empire was, what the relation was to the Khazars, which ended up becoming like when you talk about when everybody's asking me about what Gog and Magog is like, oh, you got to look at like, the renaming of things in that zone of like Turkey and like just slightly east of Turkey. Which, by the way, you blew me away by naming the 7 cities in the Bible that Jesus said, if you don't repent, you'll suffer a worse fate than Sodom. And
Hmm.
then, like you presented, like each one of those cities were like literally razed to the ground and buried. Like it's just absolutely mind blowing.
Right.
Um,
Well, that's one of those situations where, yeah, like, so you're willing to accept something that Jesus said, and then people say, "Hey, what about those churches he talked to?" Like, so
mhm,
that's the thing, is like, so dispensational would say, "Oh, well, those were just shadows of churches to come in history," and you're like, "But wait a minute. Okay, let's just think about this logically. John is getting a message from Jesus, and he's telling these churches these very specific things, and they all pretty much end with Jesus is coming very, very soon. So how could that message be for these future churches only, if they weren't to that church, those specific churches that they were written to? That's what
right.
I try to say. It's like that the main thing that we kind of have stressed to people is audience relevancy, context.
Hmm.
So if the things that were said to these churches, these cities, did not happen like they're said in there, like in a literal way, then for one, it's like it's not true at all. How would it be true to you if it wasn't true to them? And a point I've made before too is that if the things that Jesus said were going to happen didn't happen, the things that the apostles said were going to happen didn't happen, then how am I here to you 2,000 years later, whether debatably if that's true, talking about a man called Jesus if he wasn't right,
Right.
if it didn't happen? Because you're thinking about it, like, I thought it was an interesting conversation I just had with a buddy of mine, was that, isn't it interesting? So why did Nero hate the Christians again? Can anyone explain to me why did Nero hated the Christians? Like, why would he persecute that? You thinking about, like, he's going to blame the Christians for Rome burning? I think there's a lot of things about this story that don't make a lot of sense if
Hmm.
all the things are not happening at this time, right? If it wasn't the Great Tribulation, because if you think about, I mean, obviously, if you believe the Bible and you see how the Christians act in the first century, the Book of Acts, why would the Romans want to persecute them?
Right.
Because they were excellent citizens, because they
Yeah.
fed the poor, because they were really, they were very meek. Like, they would have no real reason to, unless somebody like Nero literally was possessed by
Hmm.
Apollyon, the beast.
Hmm. Absolutely. So this is like, so partly I blame myself for not knowing history. Like you guys have been educating me on what happened in 70 AD. Like I never knew that what happened. I never followed it fully through, like with the destruction that happened to the temple, the second temple. Can you walk people through 70 AD so that there's historical context?
Oh, absolutely. Well, same, brother, same. Like I said, like I said, I started going to Christian school in seventh grade, and I graduated from a Christian college. I graduated from
Hmm.
Liberty University, and my parents took me to church every Sunday. I had never heard about 70 AD until like the past couple of years,
Hmm.
and it's like, so the real question is, why not? And I think, like you said, that's a very suspect thing, is because if Jesus said the temple was going to be destroyed before this generation passes away, so it's believed that Jesus was born, believe it or not, 9/11, 3 BC,
Hmm.
September 11th, and so likely he was crucified around 30 AD, and so biblically a generation. You think about the 40 years in the wilderness.
Right.
40 years. 40 years is a number that comes up often. So 40 years after, Jesus likely says that on the Mount of Olives, the temple is going to be destroyed in that generation. It was. So in 66 AD, there was the Roman Jewish War. And what's crazy, and this is again, this is how, like, we come to these conclusions. It's prophesied by Daniel and also by John in the book of Revelation that there is this time that's 1,260 days. The Revelation 11 says that the Gentiles are given 42 months to trample the holy city. The Roman Jewish War was exactly 42 months,
Mm.
where they they encompassed, and it says in Luke chapter 11, when you see the armies, the nations encompassing Jerusalem, circling Jerusalem, flee to the mountains of Judea, get out of town.
Mm-hmm.
That's when the Romans in 66 AD, midway through the year, they circled around Jerusalem. There was a siege that obviously was, Jacob's trouble. The walls were busted down. Eventually, the stones on the temple, not one was left standing on top of the other one. And literally, so historians like Josephus and Tacitus wrote about during the siege of Jerusalem, there was soldiers in the clouds. These, the supernatural events that happened that secular historians like Josephus and Tacitus is probably the most respected Roman historian as far as the world's concerned. Josephus, Christians rely on him a lot because he wrote the Antiquity of the Jews, and he basically validates much of the Old Testament and the New Testament. He corroborates things that happen. And so Josephus was a Jewish man who became a Roman citizen, and he wrote in very great detail about this thing. And he would have no reason, because he was not a Christian, to confirm parts of the Bible like the New Testament. But it just so happens that he does. And yeah, so that happens in the first century, where the abomination of desolation. It's like I said, it's funny. So we talk about today day and age, people are talking about, oh gosh, they got these red cows from Texas. All this stuff's about to happen. They're about to build the third temple. And that, I think that was one of the clues before the red heifer. Actually, it was probably after the red heifers. I was reading through the Bible and I was like, wait a minute, so let me get this straight. So we are waiting. So Daniel talks about that there's a time where the sacrifices in the temple stop. Okay. Everyone agrees on that. And I was like, wait a minute. Yes. So we're waiting for a time when the temple's rebuilt. So a man can go in the temple to start the sacrifices, only to just have them stop right away. I was like, but they haven't sacrificed in 2,000 years. So I said, what? And it seems pretty desolate now, right? I mean, there's some, if you believe that location is legit, there's a mosque where the temple used to be. It seems pretty desolate, does it not?
Right. Yeah.
So you're kind of thinking wait a minute, this is, like I said, this doesn't make any sense. They don't even talk about building another temple. So maybe that'll happen. And again, so then when you find out details like that, I mean, to me, it really blew me away that even they talk about Antioch Epiphanes, and I think before Jesus came, they sacrificed pigs in the temple. Even it's likely they say that the zealots at the time, the Jewish zealots, that they thought for sure, because they believed in the timing of Daniel. They knew the prophecies. These people knew the prophecies, but they rejected Jesus. They believed that they were going to shut themselves in the temple and God was going to save them. And they said the zealots did all kinds of wicked stuff inside the temple. So there was all kinds of times where it could have been the abomination of desolation. The point is, that place was made desolate completely. And so all the things make sense in this context, where all the events of 70 AD were Jacob's trouble. And obviously there's a time after that where, yeah, there's things in the book of Revelation that are not written about that we have to try to piece together. But at this point, historically, I know that happened. Like I said, we know that happened. And what I was saying, I was just driving. I was kind of goofing off. I was reading the book of Jeremiah, and then I was reading Lamentations. Lamentations talks about when, it's likely written by Jeremiah, and he's lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. And he's talking about it's the same prophetic language when the first temple is destroyed. He says that the Jerusalem, the virgin daughter, was made desolate. And I was like, what's interesting about that? Obviously, that phrase, it's very triggering when you hear desolate, abomination of desolation. And I was thinking, okay, so he's using this language. And then eventually there's a call from Daniel that the temple's going to be rebuilt. And then but at some point, it's definitely made desolate by the Romans. Whether it's the Great Tribulation that's going to happen soon if you're a pre-tribber. I said, isn't it interesting if that's not what Daniel was talking about? If he was not talking about 70 AD, well, then who did? Did any other prophet prophesy what was going to happen that horrible time in the first century? If Jesus wasn't talking about that and Daniel wasn't talking about it, then who did? And I said, isn't it interesting that we have to read about the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish-Roman war, from somebody like Josephus and not from the Apostle John? If what we're taught is John wrote Revelation in the 90s, well, why didn't he write about the temple being destroyed? Why wouldn't he write about a very major prophecy that Jesus, whether all the other things happened too, Jesus said the temple is going to be destroyed. Nobody thought that was noteworthy. That's not worthy of going in, being one of the books in your Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's quite an omission, I would say.
A total incredible omission. So I'm under no illusion that history is the majority of the history that I've been told has been, especially like up until about age 35. So I'd say about 13, 15 years ago, that's when I really came into recognition. I don't know anything about history, especially learning about the Scaliger brothers and how the majority of Western history was funneled through the Scaligers in England, or in the British Isles, I should say. And so for me, I don't know how much veracity I can put on many things that I hear that are written in a book. What's the saying? Like, paper never denied ink ever. People can write anything, right? But the one thing that cannot be denied in my experience are these buildings that I'm in. And I have to say, I've gone through 7 cathedrals in Europe. I've been around probably another dozen Capitol buildings throughout the world. A very unlikely Capitol building in Nicaragua.
Oh wow!
Just these buildings that are all these we're told that they're like a Greco-Roman takeoff, or some sort of Gothic takeoff, and my father was a builder. He was a commercial builder who built skyscrapers in Florida. So I grew up really focused on essentially what can survive a hurricane. And so, because my dad was always in my ear about all this type of stuff. And then you go see these old buildings. And I was also being taught as a little kid. My dad went to university when they were impressing upon all the architecture students the Bauhaus method, which was essentially just build a box. build a box within a box, a cube within a cube within a cube. That's what they wanted in the Bauhaus architecture system. And my dad actually liked all the classical architecture that was all throughout Europe and everything like that. So go and check out, and we have all these buildings, because this is where we're bridging this little season with what do we have in our physical existence now that could actually explain these buildings. Because as Paul Staub said in his last pod, literally he used the word overbuilt, and these buildings are so overbuilt. They're so they're overcompensating. You talk about little man syndrome. If it was just regular dudes building it, and some of these buildings, I got turned on to looking for toilets. I know this sounds really funny.
No, I get it.
Back in the day, in studying, do you know who Dr. Judy Wood is? She wrote the book "Where Did the Towers Go?"
I'm not familiar with her.
It's a great way of actually doing forensics through photography, because she was a particle physicist at University of Clemson, and she had worked for a bunch of companies that were working for the DoD when 9/11 happened. And she didn't watch TV. She didn't have a TV at her house. So when she went to school or went to university that day, everybody's shocked, of course. And she's just watching the buildings fall on TV, but she's not listening to any news or any narrative. And her physics mind takes over. She's a particle physicist, she's a mechanical engineer and particle physicist. And she knew some of the companies that would have the ability to do that, because what she watched happen was clean from her perspective. She wasn't taking on the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So she wrote this book called Where Did the Towers Go? And one of the first observations when looking at the rubble of all the towers was like, where are the toilets? Because each one of those buildings had I think each one of those buildings should have had 2,000 toilets, and
Wow.
there wasn't a single toilet that you saw in the rubble. There was no toilets. So that got me
In the
thinking.
trade centers?
In the trade center, like there was like when they showed like all the pictures, all the forensic scanning of of what was that, well, 80% of the mass of those buildings never touched the ground. So
Oh,
that's a
that, I
whole
mean, that's
nother.
the thing. There was like nothing left. I mean, that's the thing is like the things that were left over were like there was hardly anything left.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like she's the one who turned me on to like where are the toilets, and that made me
Uh-huh.
think of like what learning about Versailles, and is like, wait, these guys pumped water 4 miles uphill for these massive fountains, and they're
Right.
wearing the finest of silks, and they have gold adornments on everything, and like yet you're telling me they went into an outhouse? Like, come on, guys. And like, where are the toilets? Like, where are the out? Because the very I mean, you're in contracting. The very first thing that you're thinking of when you're doing all your previstas and all your site planning is, where does the sewage go? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's the very first thing that you're doing. And so, like these buildings, like these massive, gargantuan buildings, like almost all of the entryways have been made smaller, so people our size could get through them. And then also, all the bathrooms have been added.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, what is going on? Like, and so for me, when I first came across the Little Season stuff, I thought of the Palace of Versailles because I think Conspiracies are us brought it up. And then I thought about all the yogis and the rishis that I had been around in my life. And I know, well, I shouldn't say I know them personally, but I've met people that have gotten very attuned to their body. Like they have mastery of their body. I was around a lot of pro athletes in my life, and I am not of the mind. Well, I should say it this way: I am of the mind that, like, say you're in the presence of Jesus Christ or one of these saints in their light bodies, and then your body is lit up like a Christmas tree. I'm sure those bodies, those physical bodies, don't act like our bodies do right now without that presence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know what? It's actually a thing. I was just thinking as you're saying that that so one example we have in the Bible that's very similar to that is so Moses went up into on Mount Sinai. He was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. He wasn't eating or drinking
Right.
that whole time he was there. So, and
Hmm.
obviously he came down glowing, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, I've done the longest fast I ever did was 7 days, and it was awesome. Like, I'm not saying I could live like that, but like, geez, to be in that, I call it jurisdiction with your creator, like to be in that full connection with God, in that loop currents occurring. You don't need as much of the physical stuff as possible. But the reason why I bring this up is because when Paul said, it was like Jesus overbuilt because he knew what was going to come. That like clicked so many things for me. It was like you have these people that are in the presence of Jesus Christ, and maybe not just in their physical, but they like the alpha is there, like he is the
Mm-hmm.
alpha. And
Mm-hmm.
all the bravos are doing their thing, right? They're just like completely and utterly, under inspiration, because that's what I feel a lot in some of these buildings that we're talking about. Is I feel inspired, I feel awe.
Yes.
And that's not built by wage slaves. That's not built by people that are under duress because cowboys and Indians, or you know they're settlers getting there on their wagon train. Like, just the logistics of moving heavy things. I'm trying to talk to people about, like, I literally lived on the side of a mountain that was nothing but clay. We couldn't build with heavy things. Like, you just can't get it there.
Mm-hmm. No, there's
So.
That's a great point. You know, the one thing I've even said that even when you look past the buildings, especially in America, like just the westward expansion to this place, and like the big cities, like suppose like Chicago, that just kind of just got built overnight in the 1860s. Then you go over into the West Coast, and you have like San Francisco. And I was thinking, like, the buildings themselves, obviously, even if they were meager buildings, the central planning that's involved in building a huge city, it's got to be a big deal. Like you said, you think about,
Yes.
like, if you ever go see like somebody building a neighborhood near you, what do they got to do? They got to dig up the ground. They got to be laying pipe. They got to do all, like, you can't just have cowboys just go building their little shacks everywhere. It's like that's not how cities are built. I
No.
mean, that's the kind of thing you see in a third world country where you got all these kind of slightly built houses are cockeyed and the roofs leak and they're all patched together. And then you see like San Francisco, when the earliest pictures of it, and it looks like it has about 1 million people live there. You
Right.
couldn't do, like, 1 million people could not live in any kind of rhyme or reason unless it was all strategically laid out.
Mhm.
Things were built with a purpose. A lot of planning went in. Like, you couldn't have these major ports. Yeah, then you get into and then you add into the fact that these buildings, where are they getting the materials to build all this stonework in such a quick time? Where are they getting all these bricks? Like, we're told that they didn't have like factories that are pumping these things out. It's a great one. I'm sure that you've probably seen. What is it? Is it Fort Jefferson?
Oh my God.
Fort Jefferson,
Yeah.
if you guys are not sure, it's like this. It's a star fort that's like, I think is it 70 miles off the coast of Florida, like toward.
Yes.
I think it's like toward like the Gulf of Mexico, or in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It is. I think they say it's the biggest, or it's the most bricks of any structure in the Western Hemisphere.
3 million bricks.
3 million. Okay, 3 million bricks. There's no fresh water in this place.
Mm-mm.
And you're thinking, so what we're taught is that they built this sometime around the Civil War times. Who are they trying to protect against, and protect what?
Yeah.
It was a
trading post.
You think strategically, okay, so if they were worried about, like, I don't know, invaders from like Cuba or something like that, it would be easy to avoid, right? You could go around it. 70 miles is a long way to be able to skirt around this place. And we're just told they just built this place. Like, there's many examples of that, of like how big the brick structures were. And as you were mentioned, that a lot of times there was openings, and you can see now that the openings have been altered. Yeah, they've been made to have smaller doors, like normal sized doors. And in a lot of cases, you have, all these arched windows. And what you see is they built wood up into the arch, and then they put square windows in there, because they couldn't make wood windows that would fit in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, so who's the advanced people and who are not the advanced people? It's like, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, all that on the mundane level is awesome to think about, and I did. But then once this little season theory came to my consciousness, it all clicked, because humans are lazy. So, and I'm going to qualify this. If you have 1,000 people that are in a frontier town, you're not building a city hall. What? You're getting grown men. Like, so let's just go through the narrative. You have grown men that have to defend their homes, because there's not like a police force that, like back then, everybody defended their own home front. It's not like there were lots of restaurants that people could go to get their daily food. Like, you were growing your food, you were responsible for your food, which takes a few hours if you guys haven't done that yourself. Then, so you're protecting your home front, you're building your home front, and you're feeding you're growing and feeding your home front, and then you have time to go quarry the heaviest building materials. Like, not just any building materials. Like, let's just build our city hall or the post office. Let's just build it with wood. Let's just, like, we got it. It's right here. Let's just cut it and mill it, which is hard in itself.
Mm-hmm.
No. We need the finest red sandstone, and we need the finest marble. Who's polishing all this stuff? I do tons of concrete work. I've laid thousands of pieces of tile. I work with like granite masons who lay these beautiful countertops. You had to polish that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What high speed, angle grinders and polishers were they using? And how could you move? Like my friend Mike Wilkerson, who runs the Stellium 7 channel, who goes back into like the time of the Titans, because there's all these things that are petrified that are obviously once, biology, which gives a lot of credence to the Genesis story. But like he's showing in Italy, in southern Switzerland, they have these pillars in some of these buildings that are like 40 feet tall that are one piece of marble that are flawless in the way the column actually, the way it bows in the middle and comes down, literally the angle and the degree of the insertion point at the base relative to the top is perfect. And we're told what medieval people did that, like that were just working on money, or were slaves that were under oppression from the king. No, 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 none of that makes any sense. This was a higher level of consciousness. Like I literally build domes. Like right now I'm looking on my other screen and I'm designing a dome, a 3-dome project for my neighbor. Like I build domes. Domes will raise your consciousness. Like they will do that. But like these domes that they were building, like with the arcs and then the insets that they would do, and even like things like the Arch de Triomphe, like in the
Mm-hmm.
middle of Paris. Are you telling me they just did that? Like, hey guys, let's just build this arch as like this perfect bisection way of the 6 main roads, and yeah, we're just doing it as an art project. Woohoo! No, it was a different consciousness.
Yeah, something was clearly different. That's the thing. It's kind of like what I always say, that America is the first place where like this place, like the narrative just makes no sense. Because if you think about what we're taught about, like America gained its independence from the British, right? So they didn't want to pay taxes, and so all the founding fathers wrote all these documents about how they didn't want a strong federal government. Okay, then explain Washington D.C. to me.
Right.
Explain to me who paid for that. Because you're thinking like these guys threw tea in a harbor because they didn't want to pay taxes on this tea. Meanwhile, so who donated all the money to build all those buildings? And so we're supposed to believe that, again, there wasn't a city there, supposedly, right? Where it was, what it was at Nuremberg, on these old maps, that there is places like, Chicago and a place
Yeah.
where DC is that have shown castles on there. So it's interesting that what we're led to believe is some guys on horses and buggies camped out and then built the whole city. They built for the public servants at the time a place that was as grand as Rome. And nobody had a problem with that in that time, where they literally just got liberated from this oppressive foreign government. And then, and not only that, they did this in every city, in every state, all around the country, in a time where the federal government really would not have had any money to build buildings like that. And again, yeah, like you think about, this is the kind of stuff that starts wars and revolutions is, hey, poor people who live in shacks, build me a palace.
Right.
Oh yeah, your governor needs a palace too. Oh, and your mayor needs a palace too. And people would be like, these are the people who are worried about bare necessities, just feeding themselves. I mean, we're taught like when they came over to America, these people were going to starve to death if the Indians didn't help them learn how to plant food. Eventually, they can thrive and then build these cities. But obviously, again, they don't even say that's the story, because literally during this time, we have a war with the British, a war with the British again. Then we have wars with the Indians, wars with the Spanish. We have a civil war. And then meanwhile, all these cities in America are burning down at the same time, being rebuilt. It makes no sense. It's it's funny that you mentioned like like the real impressive things like pieces of marble and granite that are huge in one piece. So how I really kind of got, maybe when I first started becoming a conspiracy theorist was when I was watching like shows like Ancient Angel or Ancient Aliens. And I was like, I really never bought the alien stuff, but I was like, but how did they build all that stuff? And so you're seeing like, without really understanding the pyramids, and then the other stuff in Egypt is probably even more impressive, like the stuff that's like, what's it, like the Serapeum, where you have those granite boxes that are like 100 tons. They're like laser precision. They're polished granite. They're in these little tiny, they're this underground section of Egypt that there's literally no place to move these things. Like,
Mhm.
so all your cheap labor wouldn't make a difference because you can't really maneuver. For one, you couldn't get a lot of people in there to do it.
Right.
And so seeing those kind of things, like statues that are very like almost laser precision, like one side of the face in these statues are exactly the same. And you're thinking like, okay, well, how did they do that? And so we're spending all this time looking at Egypt and places in Peru. Meanwhile, there's a building in your town that was supposedly built 200 years ago that's way more
Mhm.
impressive than some of those things. And we don't even like, because we didn't know what we were looking at until
Right.
recently, that they have your things that are equally impressive in your own town with way more is equally sketchy of like, oh yeah, well, they just got cheap labor to do it. When we know, like you said, humans inherently do not want to work.
No.
I think we need to work. We have a desire to accomplish things, but we really don't want to. We certainly don't want to work for some rich guy for nothing. And you think about it, like today. I mean, like there's nothing new under the sun. Most people work just hard enough not to get fired. Like, can you
Right.
imagine trying to get the people together to say, yeah, let's put a couple more arches in this building.
Yeah, yeah. Es-
Like, do we need more than
especially
this?
especially under the circumstances that we're told. We're told that it wasn't a peaceful environment.
Mm-mm.
It wasn't established. It wasn't like food or like actual commerce like between areas was something that was safe. like I don't think people understand, like it was like the story that we are given does not lend itself to great art. It doesn't lend itself to people spending, I was at this cathedral in Scotland, and I took the paid tour, and that was such a mistake because they were just feeding just like so much garbage.
Just
And
rolling your
it
eyes.
they literally had this story of this one very thin pillar that went up maybe 25 feet, maybe. And it had all this beautiful art on it, but it talked about how there was one master mason with his apprentice that did this over 40 years. And I was just like, who in like medieval days had like 40 years to commit to like a non-load bearing pillar in like that doesn't, no, that's not right. Like things were, I don't know exactly what they were, but it wasn't that story. that
Right.
story was like that story was a bunch of BS to me. And so, and that's what I'm saying. This was not a wage slave creation. Like these buildings are gorgeous and they endure. I said on my podcast yesterday, like my dad would build these big buildings that were millions of dollars in the 80s and 90s in South Florida. The insurance adjusters would give them just enough money to build these buildings to be able to last 40 or 50 years. Like that was like the given time for these, like the life cycle of these buildings. One big hurricane comes and the buildings were not what they were when you first built them. Well, we're talking about buildings that we don't even know how old they are. Let's say the timeline that you and I are exploring is correct. We had, the second temple gets razed to the ground 70 AD. When do you think Jesus and his compatriots like actually like fully embodied again, and we're like, Hey, let's go. Because I've read a lot that the millennium when millennium is said in the Bible, it doesn't necessarily mean 1,000 years. We think of it as 1,000 years, but let's just say a long while. Like if they
Mhm.
say, let's say if the accuser is, loosed upon the nations for a short while, I think that's the actual translation of it. Um, let's say the millennium is a long while. So like, okay, Jesus is embodied for a long while. He's with his camp of saints. Everybody's crushing because he's got all of his bravos. He's like, okay, we got to build all the infrastructure. We got to do all these things, worldwide, because when we bow out for a little bit, we know the accuser is going to come back and try to erase this place. They're going to try to erase the proof that we were here. So let's overbuild, guys. And everybody was like in their light body. Everybody was not in the notion of lack. They weren't under the demonic oppression that we experience now, because the devil was in the pit. So do you have a like have you refined in your mind a timeline that's relative to us now?
Unfortunately, not too well. I mean, that's what I was saying. Like that, what we know had happened in this period in Jerusalem and in Israel. There's obviously stuff that kind of corresponding. Even I was talking with my buddy yesterday about Pompeii. It's kind of interesting, the story of Pompeii.
Hmm.
This city that was basically as depraved as places like Sodom and Gomorrah somehow got burned up by a volcano, or if was it a volcano? Like, we don't really know. We just know this place was like completely burned by fire from heaven. And so this happened, what we're told, is in 79 AD. I think this is the more difficult part to really kind of figure out the exact timeline, because I think that I was talking to a lot of Christians, and I was trying to push back when people would say the 7 year tribulation. I was like, there was no 7 year tribulation. The Bible doesn't talk about a 7 year tribulation, because even if you talk
Right.
about the 40 the 70 weeks, you get 490 years, and that doesn't end with the destruction of Jerusalem. That ends before that. That was a time
Hmm.
for atonement, and then the judgment comes later. The judgment came within that generation. Now, what we can really rely on, or at least I believe would probably be the best evidence, would be you'd have shadows, things in the Bible that happen. So if God used Babylon to judge Israel with the first destruction of Jerusalem and temple, well, Babylon was not judged immediately, right? So we know that the beast is thrown into the lake of fire at some point, but it does
Hmm.
not, like, the Bible does not give us a timeline of when that happened. So that's when it gets a little more tricky, especially when you think about, just like, again, if we are skeptical of history, well, how much of it can we actually go back and say is true or what's not true? Historians debate when Rome fell. What I find interesting, and again, just by the dates we're given. Now, I can't say if this is true, but it is interesting if you go back and you look at 536 AD, which is supposedly like the worst year ever. You ever heard of that year?
I heard it. I heard from it from you guys. I heard
Yes, it was
you talk.
18,
Yeah.
18 months of darkness. There was like a plague that killed 50 million people. And this is a time when, like, there's like 150 million people worldwide, supposedly. So a third of them die of plague. There's wars at the time. It's it's obviously, there's famine, there's everything. And this is 536. And so what we're taught is this is when the dark ages started. And so it's interesting. And again, you think about when the Byzantine Empire started. I think it
Hmm.
started around, it was right around maybe it was between 300 and 500 AD.
Yeah, it's right in that 400 period. Like they
Yeah.
say,
So then you had,
Constantine moved. Like from what I understand is Constantine moved the center of the Roman Empire from
mm-hmm,
Rome, because it was a horrible logistical city to get attacked all the time. He moved it to Turkey.
mm-hmm,
You know, it's a
Constantinople. Yeah.
Constantinople, and he moved it there because like it was so much easier to defend. There was a choke point, and
Mm-hmm,
that
right.
and that so and that was in like four. It was in the 400s.
So then it's interesting is like what we're taught historically about Constantine making the Roman Empire, Christian Empire. And then I think then later after him, it was like a Theodosius, I think his name is. They had the Theodosian laws, which are literally outlawed every other religion.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a crazy. I mean, it's so funny just to think in hindsight, to go back to that point of like, if God did not do all the things he said he was going to do at the time he said he was going to do them, how does any of this happen? Even if you think about like, I was looking at up like our timeline of the way we do dates, because obviously people don't really have any understanding of like that we had BC and AD, but when did that start? So BC, before Christ, and then Anno Domino. I'm sure I said that wrong.
Domini.
Domini. So that is the year of our Lord. And so if you think about it, like, it's almost like we take for granted that at some point they decided they were going to shift all the time in the world based on when Jesus was on earth.
Awesome.
And, you know, like I said, it's something we take for granted, which is crazy though. In the same mindset, now they're trying to call it BCE and CE. They're trying to write that part out of our history that they changed. They literally changed all the time we date things of the time of Christ, and now they're trying to remove it. Sounds like, again, Satan's short season continues to try to remove evidence that there was this time that was so significant. And so this happens right around 500 BC or AD as well. And so again, then you go right into this dark age, this 1,000 years. I'm more of the mindset of, I just believe it's a literal 1,000 years, because for one, it's like, I heard it could mean, uncertain infinity. So it could be like, obviously it wasn't really infinity, but it's like this, it makes sense to us just to go like, hey, we know it's supposedly been about 2,000 years. If the millennial reign is over, it could have been 1,000 years. We knew the dark age was 1,000 years. Maybe that's when it was. And so when the age of enlightenment hit, you think about who's the light bearer? Lucifer. So if the world considers him their God, he's let loose. Now you have the age of enlightenment, where like literally it tries to undo all the things that happened before.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense.
So to me, it's like, I guess the only thing that we can see, and I think that you have people like who is it, Flamenco, and some of these people who are trying to say that the timeline's not correct. Some of these events are repeating. So that's where you get into the dicey part of like, we have concluded, or not concluded, or we speculate that some of these events might be closer together. You know, because I'm not saying like it took 70 AD all the way to 536 in order for all this to happen. These things could have happened much closer to that time period, but how could we prove that to anyone?
Right.
Because we are literally trying to, we've got a puzzle. We've got like a bunch of different puzzles. We're trying to put them together in a dark room, and we're trying to be able to reasonably figure out a timeline in that is extremely difficult. I think that's the best way to say it. Is like that if you kind of showed, like, that would be like Alpha Talks mentioned this. If you were trying to hide these things, if you spread them out on a timeline, they don't all look as significant apart from each other. If those things happened together,
if you compress them,
you'd be able to really almost go one for one. Well, this was this in the Revelation. This was this. This was this. This was this. But if you spread them out over 500 years, then people could say, nuh-uh. You know, they got plausible deniability, because they say, yeah, that's similar, but it's obviously this stuff is all going to happen at the same time. Even when the Bible doesn't even clearly say all this happens at the same time. We just know that, again, like as I said, if God took about, I was looking these things up today, that the empires, I think it was like Babylon had like 87 years of their empire. I think the Persians had like 130 something years, I believe, somewhere in that range. Like, so these empires, maybe they even had 160 years. And then you go like the Greeks didn't have very long, but so like there was a time that it took before God decided to judge them for, what they did to Israel and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's no real reason for sure to believe that there wasn't a time of Rome before it fell. Because like I said, it doesn't make sense that some people try to say, oh, it all happened right away. It's like, well, God used Rome to judge Israel. They didn't both fall on the same day.
Right.
Rome was the one who conquered them. So that even says in the book of Revelation, I believe that Rome is the beast. It talks about seven heads. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. Rome was considered the city with 7 hills.
Mhm.
The harlot, the woman, that I believe was Jerusalem. Because if you go back into the Old Testament prophets, they talked about who was the harlot, the whore.
Mhm.
That was Jerusalem. So it even says
Mhm.
Revelation 17, it talks about that the beast hated the harlot, burned the harlot with fire. So again, so the beast judges, the great tribulation, Jacob's trouble. God uses the beast to judge the harlot, and then eventually the beast gets judged himself. But that's, like I said, that's harder. And it is interesting when secular historians cannot agree about when Rome fell. Within
Yeah, there's a
hundreds of years, within hundreds of years, they debate
yeah.
when it fell. I mean, I
There's
think
a
that's pretty weird.
And then all the books, like, so that's the thing that Professor Longo was talking about with me with the Byzantine Empire, is like there's literally like only maybe a dozen books that talk about this other empire, this Christian empire that essentially was 1,000 years.
It's pretty.
Like,
That's pretty sus, isn't it? The fact that it's like not much
yeah.
happened during that. Don't even look into that. It was pretty boring then.
And out of those books, like literally, like out of those books, what's described of the Byzantine Empire, like in Constantinople, is like they had animatronics. They had all the like the tech. They had like very enlightened in like it sounds like it was a flourishing empire. I mean, obviously where they are geographically, they could control the Silk Road, so people could make a lot of arguments that they just got uber rich because they controlled the Silk Road. But the buildings that were being built there and the consciousness, like, I'm sorry, I see things in the physical as a where a being's consciousness is, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you can tell if like when you go to Walmart and you see a 400-pound person on like their own mobility thing and they're sitting there eating Doritos, you can tell that their consciousness really isn't where it needs to be for an optimal creation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the same thing with buildings. Like you can see certain buildings, you're like, oh, there's no beauty, there's no anything. And in constant like the the Byzantine Empire was just like this flourishing, forgive my term, mecca for
Mm-hmm.
all this art and love of Christ and like the different alchemists that had devoted, because I had gone away from the church and I kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater when I did that, and the baby in this case being Jesus. But I came across tons of alchemy teachings and alchemists. They all devoted everything to Christ. Like everything was to Jesus Christ, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all within this time that the Byzantine Empire reigned. In fact, a lot of people say, like, since the Byzantine Empire fell, the alchemy stuff doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes you think, again, that goes back to the architecture that was being built. It goes back to all these different things that are like, man, it makes sense that there was this true reign, because I also know how men work. Being a pro athlete, or I used to be a pro athlete, and you're a very good athlete from what you say. Um, Men don't bend a knee to a gamma. They don't bend a knee to like, they bend the knee to an alpha.
Mm-hmm.
They bend like, you've been on teams, you've been in sports. Like when the dude, like when he's the dude, you're like, all right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And imagine we're shown all these movies and all this media like where people are riding around with swords and they're like, if somebody dishonors you, you kill them. Like you're talking about what we're shown are super proud beings, like in the that were an honor culture.
Yeah, honor mattered.
In an honor culture, you really only bend the knee to the alpha.
Mm-hmm.
And you would only give your, like, I would, as a kid growing up, I was like, why were all these like subsistence farmers and serfs and stuff giving the money to the king? Like, under penalty of death. Okay, they were threatened. You talk about being lazy and not producing much, but imagine the difference of like, no, the king was anointed by Christ,
Right.
and like
Hmm.
in everybody knew it. That's a whole different thing. Then you can see how the power dynamics of what real humans, how we actually really act, how that would happen.
Yeah, for sure. You know, it's funny. I want to go into that point where you're just saying about the, like, yeah, the higher level of consciousness. I was thinking about that too, because I'm not one of these people who think like God sent angels to do it, and I don't know specifically that the saints helped build the buildings. But I was saying what we know from the Bible, because it doesn't really say anything about the building of buildings other than obviously, eventually heaven's a great place. What I find interesting is that if the devil was bound, and if you didn't have this constant spiritual battle that you can't see, where your mind is being twisted and pulled in directions you don't even want it to go, like if
Hmm.
you actually had a freedom in your own headspace, like what is man capable of? And
Hmm.
I think that, like, it's clearly not a time like this. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's no question that it was a time that was better than this, because yeah, like we are in the, like those of us who are in the rat race, we don't have time to build things that are that beautiful. Like
No.
that's people who obviously took time and they had care of what they were doing, and they weren't doing it for a paycheck, because
Nope.
I don't think you do stuff like that for a paycheck. It takes a love for what you're doing and a purpose. And I think that yeah, that that is obviously true. That's why you say that if we were all together, we weren't trying to live paycheck to paycheck. We weren't just trying to buy plastic crap that was going to break in a day. Like, what could we do that if we had potentially free energy, we didn't have to worry about that. We didn't have to pay the government for the places we live in.
Hmm.
If you had free energy, you had a place to live, and then you took care of, like, obviously it was a time where there was fruitful times of like livestock and harvest. What would we be capable of? So I think that it's very likely that, like, that would be for sure what would be the truth, is that we could do more without the devil's hindrance. And so now that the devil is back, seems clearly to me that he's back. Yeah, then this is what you get. You get a very selfish culture. It's like, yeah, I'm going to do just enough not to get fired. And if I do
Hmm.
want to do more, it's only to fulfill my most depraved desires, my selfishness, hoarding money, and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me, because again,
Yes.
like that, I can imagine like even people who do stuff like us, like we make videos or do different other kinds of art. A lot of the stuff we do it because we want it to look a certain way, right?
Hmm.
And we're not actually doing it for the money. We're doing it because I have to make this look right, because it's going to bother me if it doesn't.
Hmm.
Like, so you kind of do it of the love of like making something that you could be proud of, versus somebody's doing it for a paycheck. Then meanwhile, there's all kinds of other jobs we do, and we leave as soon as we're allowed to leave. I don't want to be here 1 second more, because as long as, I mean, I literally am only doing this so I can do the other things that I actually want to do. That
Right.
this seems to me this is a different time. And one more thing, to offer a possible alternative. What I find interesting is, so if we're going to give Rome the credit for building things like the Parthenon, I think it was interesting. I know John Levy did a video about this, and he was showing, and this was kind of blowing my mind, of like, that maybe this is examples of like the timeline being stretched out, that maybe these things were much closer together, because he was
Yes.
showing like the old Penn Station, and he was showing like the inside of the dome, and it's like the same. And I remember thinking like,
Uh,
that really blew my mind, because it's like, this is the same, whatever they use seems to be the same technology. So
yes.
the other possible the other possible idea was that the Roman Empire was much bigger than we ever realized. Maybe some of this stuff was, remnants of this other older culture, and that's what that could be possible too. Is that after Satan was defeated, Rome was defeated, that this time of peace was them literally taking over some of these old structures too that the Romans could have built.
I mean,
well, at least if you think about it, there's examples in the Bible where it even says that, like when the Israelites are going into the Promised Land, it says you're going to live in houses you didn't build. You're going to drink wine from vineyards you didn't plant. So maybe that's possible too. Just throwing that out there.
It could be a possibility. I mean, there's a weird thing that I have a connection to all this Roman building from, because I studied how to make geopolymers. And for those of you out there that don't know what a geopolymer is, it's essentially an acidic binder that binds an aggregate where the binder and the aggregate fuse. So after that process, chemical reaction happens, you end up with essentially rock. you end up with a product where it's indiscernible from rock. And so my mentor, Dr. Davidovitz, he figured out in the 70s how to make this. And he showed in Egypt like how they were able to make these massive limestone casting stones with what's there, like the different things that were in the environment. But there's a problem. There's one big problem with geopolymers, at least from my perspective, is that you need a couple natural constituents that are very, very rare. And who's to say, maybe they just used it all up throughout the world. But you need this naturally occurring natron and this other, it's a sulfur-like material. And you add that to whatever calcium bentonite clay, whatever, aggregate that you have that has silica, all these things, and you can essentially make this stuff. And it gets stronger over time, depending on the conditions. And for me, I'm thinking, okay, we're taught that there's only like 2 places on the planet that have it.
Oh, really?
There's the pozzolon, like they call it pozzolanic ash because it came from the volcano Pozzolon in Italy. So the ash that came from that, they call it the pozzolanic ash. And then they're like North Korea. So it's just like, what do you like? These buildings were everywhere, like everywhere are built out of this stuff. And to give you an example, I was in the capital of Nicaragua like 14 years ago doing a border run when I lived in Costa Rica. And I ended up being in the capital because Nicaragua is poor, man. It's not the best place to go to. But like when you get to the capital and you're there, it's like these beautiful, cobblestone roads and like Spanish, wrought iron and these Greco-Roman buildings. And I'm sitting there with my girlfriend at the time, and we're just having this wonderful meal. And I'm smoking a cigar after dinner, and I'm just like looking at like what we're in, and I'm like, how is this here? And then like then the next day I wake up and I see these guys that are trying to patch, like they're trying to like, maintain the Capitol building that was across, like our hotel was like, kitty corner to it. And it was like this really nice old Spanish, they call it Spanish, reclaimed Spanish. And they're trying to like patch like this like mortar edge work with conventional concrete, and it doesn't stick to it. It doesn't want to stick to that. So here we are, like, how did these structures, like, and you could see by the aging of the original building, like the coloration of it, this like grayish green color to it, that the majority of the buildings had that fascia on it, these older, beautiful buildings. And the new cement, just, you could see all the new cement patchwork just wasn't working. And so, like, that's a huge thing in masonry, is trying to patch something new onto something old. And I'm like, where do you get the materials to do this? Like, this was, to me, I don't think it was the Romans. I don't think it was like this. There was there was technology and
Hmm.
techniques that were post Roman Empire that were of a higher quality, so therefore a higher consciousness, that had just, whatever this Christ Empire was. I think it went to every continent, because there's places in a lot of people don't know, like you go into deep Asia, there's still Greco-Roman
I know
buildings there.
that's again, yeah, I think those kind of places, again, just like America does, the timeline of America, that really makes no sense. Like it makes no sense that some of the poorest countries in South America have some of the craziest awesome buildings there. And it's
Hmm.
like, so when did these get built and why? Like, we're and
Yeah.
it's what's interesting is how like these things are almost looked at as like bad. They call them like colonialization. It's like it's a bad thing. You see these immaculate places, and you like, yeah, they're awe inspiring. Which I found it was very interesting. Some years ago, before I was waking up, I was watching this documentary. It was an old documentary from the like a I don't know, maybe it's like a BBC thing, and these guys were talking about like classic colonial architecture versus the brutalist style that came after World War II.
Hmm.
And it is interesting when you kind of look into the idea of like the places the Allies bombed, churches they bombed, and supposedly there was bad guys in it, and then they find out some of these stories are all they're very sus. Like there was no bad guys in them. They just bombed churches. Like they bombed Dresden, which was like, I guess people say that it was on the level like Paris as far as beauty goes. They just
Mm.
destroyed these old world buildings, and then what they put up in their stead is these block buildings that all look
Right.
like prisons. And it was interesting. Like you said, to talk about the consciousness. What they were kind of saying is that when you see classic, beautiful old world buildings, they're literally awe inspiring. They're awesome.
Mhm.
And you look and you probably look at it and you feel a certain way and you think, man, maybe we're capable of a lot more than this. And then
Yes.
when you see those brutalist blocks that literally make you feel like, oh, I mean, every kind of what all these movies about this totalitarian future all have those buildings. And we
Hmm.
just we just see it and it's like you just feel like fear and you just feel like darkness. And so they were talking about how like you know, they were asking the British people because I guess they were building some public housing. What kind of buildings would you guys like to live in? And everybody said they wanted like brownstones. Well,
Hmm.
what they built was one of these block buildings, apartment buildings.
Hmm.
And then when you see those buildings, they're all stained and they just look horrible. And then there's just filth on the streets. And then they show like the nicer parts. Those are the places that get gentrified. People
Hmm.
take care of things that are pretty, and then the
Yes.
things that are ugly, their behavior is equally ugly. And I was like,
Yes.
I was like, all that made so much sense to me. I was like, whatever even considering that, I was like, that all makes perfect sense. Yeah. And then you put that on a level of grand cathedrals, and then not only the outsides of them, you go insides of them, and they make you feel a certain way. Like you just don't like you can't even. I can imagine if you did go in a place to worship God in a place that's like that. Yeah, there's something about it that is. And
Hmm.
like again, now you get into like the idea of not only were these things beautiful in that kind of way, they were built for acoustics. And then when people are
Oh,
singing or there's organs in there, and it's literally making you feel a certain way versus I imagine if that is true that you could get something positive out of that, the opposite's probably true about these block buildings that are awful. Yeah, that probably literally rots your soul out. I mean, it probably kills your body to go into places like that. And I
oh,
imagine based on what I know about the people who built it and probably who they were following, they probably did that on. I mean, I imagine they did it on purpose.
absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much evidence that the brutalism movement was actually to subdue consciousness, because they brought in the brutalist movement at the same time that they brought in operant conditioning. And so in operant conditioning entrains you. And when you're when somebody's under entrainment, the best way to say it is that you just run a program. You don't actually go under, you're not using your prefrontal cortex. The operant conditioning works on the reptilian brain and the medulla oblongata. So you get into like the bell system, and there's all these alarms and lights, and everything is just to make you react. And it's very, very well documented that brutalism, operant conditioning, and then all the campaigning using fear as the driver, or I shouldn't call it campaigning, propaganda, where you
Mhm.
use fear as a driver. All those things lock people into their lower centers of their being. And when you can't come up, when you can't have the energy in your prefrontal cortex, you become very, very emotional. Like you're always locked in like some sort of fear neuroses, or some sort of you know let's just say, let's just keep it simple. It's a way of becoming very paranoid and neurotic. You'll never find paranoid and neurotic people being uh, artistically brilliant. That just doesn't happen. Like all the energy that creates these beautiful buildings that we see is from the heart up. It's loving, it's open communication, it's thinking clearly, it's thinking through a process. Like we were just talking about like what it takes to just move something from A to B, right?
Mhm.
Imagine all the logistics that are like you and I have built. Like it's a ton of like, I'm no longer a heavy, like I'm the boss. I'm doing all logistics just for these little projects that I do. A couple thousand square feet. The logistics are out of this world. When they're talking about building buildings that were 500,000 square feet, like it's absurd to think. Like the level of consciousness is so high. It's
Mhm.
on a different level. And I'm not saying consciousness from a new age perspective. I'm talking about inspired Christ consciousness. I'm talking about, hey, I can work as long as you need me to work, and I love it. And I'm down, and like plus like you're talking about acoustics and harmonics. I've done podcasts with Stephanie Herman, where she has this couple books. Her last book is called The Next Octave, and she has been posting, how these harmonics work within cathedrals. I was supposed to interview Tanya Harris. I worked with her for a project for the World Economic Forum, but she's the woman that actually measures. She's the one that can measure the internal volume of a space and find its resonant frequency. And
Interesting.
dude, her work, I think she did this in 2013. She found, I forget how many cathedrals she did this in Europe, but she went into these cathedrals when she found the cymatic frequency, the resonant frequency of the actual cathedral. It matched, the cymatic pattern matched the rose window inlay.
Yeah, that is. I've seen stuff about that. That is. I mean, it actually makes sense. It makes sense that sound was used to create some of the the designs in those buildings, because otherwise, it's what do they think? People really took like a little chisel and they were just doing
Now,
that, and they
now
matched them all the same and everything.
in so many of those cathedrals, they have depictions in stained glass. And by the way, the stained glass, the coloring in the glass, we can't do that now. We do this like paint on top glass. Like
Hmm.
these paintings and these reliefs that they were doing, they're like 3-4 microns thick. Like there's things that we can't explain how they were done with the story that we're told. But then also you see in these stained glass depictions medieval Jesus. Like there's literally art of Jesus broing out with like what we consider medieval people.
Yeah, I
Like
know. Paul's mentioned a few times that there's places where Jesus is depicted, and he's like wearing the clothes like about the times that they're in. And that is weird because it's like I would never, make. I mean, I would think it's odd. It would be odd to make art where like, yeah, Jesus is wearing like a Hawaiian shirt like I am.
Now
But
here's
yeah,
an
like but they would depict him in like like medieval attire or how we would see medieval.
they were depicting him as if he was their contemporary.
Yeah, right.
And so I've had communications with two shamans on opposite sides of the world because I was in the ayahuasca world for like 10 years. And I was dealing with the shaman from Brazil and his ayahuasca lineage. I was asking him about it, and the lineage was the Daime. It's the Santo Daime lineage. And he says his upline met Jesus in the jungle. And I'm like, what, were you high? Like, what, were you tripping or whatever? And no, he was straight up. He's like, no, Jesus came to us. Like, he like came in the flesh, like he was present and presented himself. And then this monk that I knew through my family from northern Thailand, southern Laos, he said in his lineage of the monkhood, his Buddhist monkhood, that they're like top, I forget what they call the like the beginning of their line of their monks. He met Jesus in the flesh. So in my consciousness, I've been trying to resolve this is like, how could you have people from different areas of the world all saying that they met? And I was trying to talk them out of it. Like I was trying to say, oh, no, you mean an image, or they saw a likeness, or they're like, no, Jesus Christ was here.
That's
And I'm
interesting.
like, and so to me, that's why this millennial reign thing like really like is awesome, because it's like, if you are here for 1,000 years, you can kind of get around, you know?
Well, I guess that's the thing. It's like I'm still trying to like work that out in my head about what the millennial reign was really like. Because I think that's what I mean, I think that both things have to be true. I believe that in the same way it's my belief that if Jesus, when he's resurrected, he's both physical and spiritual. So he can
Yes.
do things that we cannot do, but he can also do things that we can do as well. Like he can be touched, he can eat, he can
Hmm.
go places, he can sit down. So in the same way though, he's obviously has this spiritual physical body. So I believe the place they were at, the New Jerusalem, was also similar in that way, where it's a
Hmm.
physical place, but it's also a spiritual place. I don't think that people like us would have access to it until we have glorified bodies as well. But
Hmm.
yeah, I believe that they likely. So it's my thought process that it makes sense that they were in a place that was probably unattainable to mortal people like us, but they could come and go as they please, just as angels could interact in the Bible as well. Like the Old Testament talks about that men showed up, two of them were angels, one of them was the Lord, with
Hmm.
Abraham. And so they ate a meal with Abraham. And then the angels went into Sodom and Gomorrah and called down fire from heaven to destroy the place. So I think in the same way it's my thought process that the saints replace the rebellious sons of God, the watchers, the fallen angels, and they basically became like angels. I mean, I think that's what it says in Daniel. It talks about the wise will shine like stars. So yeah,
Hmm.
so at that point, I don't know, man. But again, it's interesting when you think about even in Revelation 20, it mentions at the end of the short season that Satan gathers the nations to go make war. So it also has to be a physical place. So
Hmm.
it has to be some way that we can see it. So I guess that's the whole thing where it's like it's hard to like I said, it's hard to know, but I think that's why Satan could deceive people in this time, because if it was like again right down where Bibi Net not Yahoo goes to work, like there would be no way the devil could really trick people in that kind of way. But obviously
True.
it's got to be something more. It's got to be, again, when Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world.
Mhm.
I've actually even we've speculated on the last podcast, and actually I recorded another one with a friend that it did not actually record properly, so we're gonna have to do it again. We're probably gonna do it live next week. But we're talking about, isn't it interesting when you just think about the way that like the Bible talks about earth and land and world, and when we've been kind of had our minds ingrained the globe. So when we hear earth, we think about like the whole thing. When I believe in a lot of times in the Bible, it's talking about the land, the earth, the whole land. That's
Mhm.
those are different terms, right? Like if I told you everything in this land was burned, you wouldn't assume that I was talking about the whole world, but he's talking about this specific place. So I was thinking about it in the same way. Are there lands that we can't get to, worlds that we couldn't get to on this same plane that is just, we're just not, we don't have access to it at this point.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think the Prague clock, which Prague would have been like right in there in the Byzantine Empire, the Prague clock, before they changed the face of it actually showed this more extended land.
Yeah, so
And
we were speculating that if the procession of like the
yeah,
the whole Maseroth, and if ages shift, wouldn't that kind of shift where the procession of the sun goes? And if the
yes.
procession of the sun went to other parts of this greater realm, yeah, then more land could be exposed. And I thought about that. I was like, it makes sense is that if the heavenly city is in this place that's basically lit up by Jesus himself, so it does not need the sun. We need the sun.
Mhm.
That land does not need the sun. Isn't it interesting when it talks about the people who are thrown out of the place, they're cast out into outer darkness. Whatever would
What's
be
that?
outside of that place would be pretty dark, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
So I thought about that, and it's like, wow, you really think of it. It could be isolated in the same realm, but as far as we're concerned, that would be outer space to us, because
Mhm.
anything outside of the circuit of the sun would be outer space. Now, I'm not talking about ET. I'm not talking about Star Wars. I'm talking about a place that's on this plane that we just do not physically have access to it. And maybe that's why the governments of the world are limiting our movement on this plane.
I think so. I mean, they put us in the prison of the mind. The Panopticon is our own belief system. So just like we were saying before, you know, most people like they're not willing to go past what they've been taught.
Mm-hmm.
And because I find the fear for most people of like middle tier to lower tier intellect, the biggest thing that they're trying to hide from the world is how stupid they are. So what they do is they can never admit when they're wrong. So when they believe something that they've been taught, it's not because they thought about it. It was just that they memorized it and they hold on to it like it's the last thing ever. And that's why they so viciously fight. And then also the whole entrainment technology in education over the last 100 years, a lot of times when you're talking to people about what they've been entrained or indoctrinated into, you're dealing with a program. You're dealing with like the first generation AI. You're not even dealing with that person. You're dealing with like a whole sub program that's been programmed into them that they don't even know why they're reacting and why they're emotional and why they are the way they are. Which all to me fits so perfectly into what it says in Revelation 20 is like that whole thing is like, the accuser is loosed upon the nations to deceive them for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
Like as I understand nations, what people think of a nation now is like a legal term for like a corporate entity of a
Mm-hmm.
geographical space. Nation back then wasn't that. Nation was a group of people that had a synonymous belief. That's what a nation is. So if the accuser is released, and then he's there to deceive groups of people that have beliefs, That's everyone. Like it's like
Yeah.
it's not just each nation like per se, you know. And then you have all the dealings with the powers and the principalities and all this type of stuff. For me, it just makes a lot of sense that let's just say this whole theory is correct. It would make sense to me why everything that's worth knowing I've been lied to about. You know what
Yeah,
I'm saying? Because
absolutely.
every belief pattern I've had has been a lie. It's been something that's been tried to be ingrained that wasn't accurate. So it's very amazing to think of the implications of this. Like every day I contemplate it, the implications of it grow greater and greater for me. And it fortifies my faith. Like I actually, it gives me like a real positive turn. I'm already a positive dude anyway, but like any of the nihilism that might have been like lurking in like the back of my mind or whatever is being dissolved by this, because just the notion to think that, you know, this Christ presence was trying to kind of take care of us in every way possible. You know, it's like, you know, I'm here for you always in all ways. You know, like it's just
Hmm.
that it's that energy that, you know, like I just had blinders on. Like I didn't see it before that now. And so have you seen like a change in your demeanor and consciousness since really considering this?
Oh yeah, definitely. I was saying that, yeah, it's only increased my faith. I think it's the willingness to accept that this could be true is a frightful thing for a lot of people who are believing that Jesus was going to come any minute now. But
Mhm.
once you're willing to accept it, you're like, it's only made more sense. It's only made me feel more like that Jesus, I can believe everything he said, because it's like if I can look back and see the things he said came true, well, then I know that I feel even more assured. Not that I didn't have faith before, but I mean, it's obviously when you get more evidence of the things you believe. Yeah, so I feel like a lot more confidence, and I feel a lot more of like seeing the stuff that's in the news and the stuff with the red heifers, the stuff with like the latest thing about Neuralink and microchips, and I'm not as fearful about that. I'm kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's not like that I don't take note of it, because I know that if that affects the rest of the world, I mean, it's still going to affect me. But
Mhm.
I'm not like, oh gosh, let's get the bunker ready. The Great Tribulation is about to start. So in that kind of way, I'm kind of thinking like, hey, God is God is true to His word very
Mhm.
clearly. I don't have to worry about whatever the next person who claims to be a prophet says.
Right.
I can know that those kind of things happen. And it's funny when you kind of sit back and you watch it and you're like, yeah, you people will come around eventually, especially because I think that, man, it does feel like that something has changed with, like I said, that my friends who came up to these conclusions independently of me. I mean, I feel like the spirits move, and I feel like that the knowledge is increasing. I feel like that it's such a crazy thing when all these certain conspiracy communities, especially ones that were not Christian at all, start to arrive at,
Mhm.
hey, maybe this has something to do with Jesus. And it's like, gosh, it's so perfect when you think about it. You're like, okay, so Jesus is the truth. You have people are genuinely curious about all the lies they've been told. They really want to find out the truth, and then eventually leads them
Right.
to the ultimate, the way, the truth, and the life. And so I think it's great. I mean, I think it's absolutely awesome, because it's funny because I've gone on different conspiracy podcasts who are not like inherently Christian channels,
Mhm.
because like it's one thing. It's kind of like, it's funny, even like there's certain channels who focus on like cryptids and stuff, and a lot of people like cryptid stories, but eventually they end up kind of, it's all the same thing. Oh, there's something
Yeah.
spooky. But if you have somebody who comes on there with like a perspective that explains what they could be, well, now you've actually got something, and now we've got
Mhm.
something to build on. And I think that that's what we've got right now. Is you have a lot of people who, like, secular people who've done great research in this community, they have been able to lay a lot of the foundation for the things that we have, like we're piggybacking on, and now we have actually we're going to the next level to kind of say what this is. I think it's pretty awesome. I feel, I guess, emboldened by this. I feel like that yeah, God is moving, and there's a lot of people who are going to wake up, because it's funny, even like there was a big channel debating about like the rapture and stuff, and I know a lot of, I was waiting for people in this community to go over and say, oh, you guys are still debating that? You guys want to catch up to where we are over here? Because I do think that people are going to come into this agreement, because I think that the people who are setting dates, they're talking about different times. Those dates are going to come and go, and certain people are probably going to go the opposite way, and some people are going to say, I know whatever God says is true. Maybe what I've been taught is wrong, and then we'll be able to say, hey, guess what?
Hallelujah. And another thing that a lot of people haven't brought up, or at least I haven't heard yet, is like, do you know who Cal Washington is? The gentleman that's like really connected how to do notice of liabilities and how to like navigate the law thing without a lawyer.
No, I have not.
Well, he's a Christian, and he's somebody that is probably like one of the best biblical scholars I know personally. And on my podcast and on other podcasts, he really gets into essentially the biblical basis of the law. And essentially his notion is that the accuser right now is making his claim on, he's making his claim to his father, you know, the almighty God in heaven. And he's saying his claim is that we are not worthy of God's love. Like we are not as dignified as his angelic hosts are. And he's making that claim. So everything in God is fair. God's listening to this claim. And he told me this before I ever came across the little season, right? And then listening to Paul talk about how like this is actually fair to have a season after the millennial reign where all the souls that didn't get to know Jesus Christ could incarnate and come to know the truth. You know, all these souls show up, you know, that have the ability to come to know Christ, right? And God gave us free will because that's in his image. We're in his image, right? So this is all kind of coming together for me in such a nice, beautiful package, in the sense that, okay, pretty much we have this law system where it really is, if you take the time to like know what the accuser is saying to you or what claims he's making on you, you can counterclaim. You can so easily counterclaim. And you can do that on every level. You can do that on like the physical level, the legal level, the spiritual level. And it just like I always like kind of lean into the movie The Devil's Advocate, because it always resonated with me when Al Pacino playing the devil, he's like, can anybody deny that the 20th century hasn't been all mine?
Yeah,
Like that is like this incredible. And the way he said it with such utter confidence, I was like, man, that is an awesome claim.
Yeah, Alpha Talks brought that up, and I thought about that because I said I've seen that movie years ago, and I've seen people use that clip, especially when we make reels and stuff. And I thought that is a very interesting line, because it's like if the devil hadn't been locked up for a while, why would he be taking credit for now? Like, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like that seems odd, and it's like, well, the opposite. I mean, it makes more sense in this context where it's like that if you think about it, if he was released, and again, he's not going to be able to undo all the people, like to make them forget about what happened before right away. And maybe when it got to the 20th century, it's like finally he's saying, yes, this is all me now. Now I've really got the people going to the way I want to. Literally, if you think about it, like you go all the way into like the Rockefeller school systems, that finally this generation of people are being taught the history that I want them to know. And now this century's all mine. Who could deny it? It's all about me. And
Yes.
it makes absolute perfect sense.
And what does Keanu say to him? He goes, "But why the law? Why the law?" And what's the reply? The law touches everything, my son.
Interesting.
Like it's literally, it's like right there. Like, so, when you look, like there's no phase of your life where there's not some sort of claim that's being made one way or another. There's not one aspect of your life where you don't have somebody that isn't trying to have agency over you. And what Cal taught me and what I've learned through my own spiritual practice is like, we're actually here to refute all claims on us and only have one jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means kingdom. Like only have one kingdom, and you can only have a true kingdom with your creator. That's it. That's it. Boom. And all other claims that are being made, you cannot serve two masters. You just can't. It doesn't work that way. So I see this little season as being the grace that's bestowed upon the souls that didn't have the opportunity to actually, with their free will, choose to be in jurisdiction with their creator.
That's interesting. I have a different interpretation on that, because I think that Paul has talked about that. He believes that some of these people, that we are the resurrected of the people who didn't know. But I think there's an alternate explanation that just not everyone dies during, Armageddon and those battles. It mentions like a third of the earth dies. So there's also people who are not saints, the people who are related to them, who survived this time. So I'm more, because I think that I don't know that, for one, I don't know that that's wrong, but that's the way I always viewed it, because it talks about the rest of the dead were not resurrected until after the 1,000 years. It doesn't say immediately. It could be we're all resurrected before we go through the great white throne. Right. No, but at the same time, like, yeah, I think that if the devil is one thing, he has a system that works. The one thing I wonder is, like, again, if he could have claims over people who are not in Christ, because it's like Christ paid the debt. So it's like whatever we did at that point, paid in full. So he could not make a claim over somebody who's in Christ. But yeah, at the same time, I do believe that makes sense to me when he's the accuser. I do believe that that's likely what he was. He wanted to claim on the earth. If man was given dominion over it, I think that the serpent had always made the argument that this guy, man, Adam, is not worthy of this place. Look at him. Look at how he made him stumble so easily. And of course, ultimately, Jesus did what we could not. He resisted the devil, died, rose again, and fulfilled all the law. And therefore, now we have the opportunity to have a kingdom that we don't have to wait for, like, a lot of the people think now. And it makes, like I said, again, those kind of things make me more inspired that this is what God always was offering us. And I think that am I still good? I'm seeing like I look like I had an issue with my live stream.
You're good on this side.
Huh. Let me see. I don't know what it's doing. I think it feels like it's, well, I think it might have just bugged out on my other side, but.
Did you break the internet again?
I don't know what it did. It seems like this has never happened before.
What's a good sign?
Yeah, probably so.
The algorithm's like, dude, this dude's vibing too hard.
Yes, browse. Okay, this is weird. Okay, it looks like we're back.
Awesome.
Well, maybe we should wrap it up before this. We have to.
Yeah. So, JT, this has been awesome to get to talk to you for this first time, for this premiere conversation. Just so you know, like we just like touched like just the tip of the arrow with this, especially from my perspective, because I didn't even get to talk to you about the Black Earth. Because at my company, I have my podcast is called the Biocharisma Podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I make biochar. I'm expert at making Black Earth and know what it takes to get this highly diamagnetic material. And like Alpha Talks has talked about it, and like who is it? Bible Scribe. All these people have talked about this Black Earth that has been found, over the third of this plane of existence. And there's just all these really neat things that, like I said, this whole thing that you've been bringing to light, it really relaxes me. It's like taking the question mark off of so many things. It just makes too much sense. And I really thank you for your presence in the alternative media space. It's been wonderful for me to get to watch.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. Yeah, this is a great conversation. Yeah, it's funny. As many of these podcasts we've talked about this, I think there's so many still unexplored areas. Like you said, trying to figure out timelines and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, like you said, it's an interesting. You have like a third of the Earth is like desert. You have like a third that's this charred Earth. Even the science writes about like a time a third of like the sea life died.
Right.
All this stuff was written about in the Book of Revelation. It's kind of weird that that's in there. And as people who believe it, it's like, yeah, again, my faith is not blind. There's lots of evidence to back up the things we believe now. And it is. I said, somebody had this comment. I wish I remember their name, but I said it was a really cool comment somebody sent me, and they said, there's a lot of people who are lamenting or like where they were really happy that, hey, we're living in the end times, the time when Jesus is going to come back. We were raised up at such a time as this. And they said, but you know what? I think it's actually a pretty great calling. If it wasn't that time, that you had eyes to see in the most deceptive time and all of man's existence. And I was like, you know what? That is pretty cool, because it is like, so now we have lots of things to see to prove what we believe. And it's like, yeah, that God has blessed us with eyes, mind, and a heart to be able to see these things. It's truly a blessing.
It really is. It really is. And I mean, I'm going to share your work. I've already been sharing your work, but as long as you're putting stuff out, I'll be sharing it. And I really look forward to the next time that we get to wrap, because as you could tell, this could keep going and going and going. So
for sure.
I know it's late over there on the East Coast, so I'll let you go. Thank you again. Tell people where they can find you, and I'll put links out and all the rest of it later.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, so yeah, obviously you guys can find me on YouTube, JT Follows JC. That's pretty much how I go on every channel. But I do stuff if you're on social media, I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. If you find me on here, you can click on my bio. I'll have all the links. I'm on Rumble. Sometimes we do stuff on Spotify and all that kind of stuff. The stuff that's a little too hot for YouTube, we'll put over there.
Yes.
And then, of course, I said I mentioned before that we did a documentary called Ancient Angels. Obviously, it's a play on ancient aliens. We talk about the megaliths, giants, angels, demons, aliens, all that good stuff. So if you guys are interested in that, you guys should check that out. But once again, man, Topher, I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. Well, you have a good one, my friend. Sleep well over there on the East Coast, and let's do this again soon.
Absolutely. God bless you, brother.
God bless you also. Bye-bye.
All right. Let's see. All right, I'm still okay. So that was a pretty good stream on my end. We had